the early summer of 1718, a large, heavily armed ship approached a shifting coastal channel in North Carolina. Before Blackbeard captured her, she had been La Concorde, a French slave ship of about 200 tons, armed with 16 cannon. In pirate hands, she became the flagship Queen Anne's Revenge. As it navigated the treacherous approach into Beaufort Inlet, the ship struck a submerged sandbar and grounded hard. The physical mechanism of the loss was brutally simple, dictated entirely by shallow coastal geography and the immense momentum of a heavy wooden ship driving into an immovable wall of compacted sediment. But the stakes of that precise maneuver remain locked behind an unresolved historical argument. The motive behind the loss has never been proven. Some accounts suspect a navigational disaster in a dangerous inlet. Others suspect Edward Teach may have used the grounding to strand surplus men and consolidate stolen wealth. The evidence cannot decide the question with certainty. The intent no longer mattered the moment the timber keel wedged into the unforgiving sandbank. The grounded ship was trapped. Contemporary accounts and site evidence suggest that attempts may have been made to assist or pull vessels free, but the effort failed. Once the flagship could no longer be saved, the crew stripped what they could from the wreck and transferred people and supplies to smaller, shallow draft support vessels. Valuable supplies, portable wealth, light weapons, and useful rigging were taken away. Left behind was the staggering, immobile mass of the ship itself. Blackbeard's flagship was believed to have carried up to 40 cannon, and the wreck site later revealed a dense scatter of cannon, anchors, ballast stones, and ship hardware in shallow water off Beaufort Inlet. The pirates vanished, sailing away from the inlet and leaving the wreck in a hostile coastal zone rather than a deep offshore grave. This shallow depth did not offer a calm sanctuary for the remains. Instead, it was an incredibly hostile, high-energy coastal zone. The shallow water ensured that the wreck remained entirely within the destructive reach of surface wave action. In a coastal grounding, a ship does not gracefully slip into a peaceful abyss. It is battered, exposed, buried, and exposed again by surf, tide, and shifting sand. Over time, the upper works of the flagship deteriorated, while the heaviest pieces of the vessel settled into the lower wreck deposit. Cannon, anchors, ballast stones, and ship fittings became concentrated around the surviving hull structure, creating a dense archaeological mass rather than a clean, intact ship. Over time, the highly dynamic sand of Beaufort Inlet washed over the wreckage. Coastal currents constantly reshaped the shallow seabed, filling gaps between the fallen iron and covering surviving lower structure with sediment. The immense mass of weaponry and ballast disappeared into the coastal floor. The ocean erased the visual footprint of the wreck, hiding the remaining structure beneath a flat, featureless plain of shifting sand. For nearly 3 centuries, the exact location of the frigate remained completely hidden from the surface. The deliberate stripping of the ship had left behind only a dense, extremely heavy metallic core buried in the shallows. Once the surviving crew stripped the ship and vanished, what physical reality took hold of the massive iron arsenal abandoned in the Atlantic surf? Visual search in a coastal inlet is an engineering dead end. The waters off the North Carolina coast are clouded by suspended sediment, marine life, and shallow Atlantic surf. Any wooden structure that survived the initial grounding could be buried beneath a moving blanket of sand. To locate a lost 18th century shipwreck in this hostile visual environment, investigators could not rely on sight alone. They had to combine historical research, remote sensing, and diver verification. The key tool was magnetometer survey. A magnetometer does not see shape, color, or texture. It measures variations in the local magnetic field of the Earth. When a concentration of iron lies under sand and water, it can create a localized magnetic anomaly that a sensitive instrument can detect. The abandoned cannon, anchors, and iron fittings of a heavily armed ship were exactly the kind of target that could produce that signal. On November 21, 1996, a search team from Intersal, operating under a state permit, found a cluster of cannon and anchors on the seabed near historic Beaufort Inlet. The discovery did not rest on a single dramatic spike alone. It was the combination of historical research, remote sensing, seabed targets, and follow-up archaeology that opened the site. To verify the target, dive teams entered the low-visibility surf and worked the seabed by touch as much as by sight. The magnetic signature had not lied. Buried in the sediment was a tightly packed cluster of historic iron weaponry and maritime hardware. Among the earliest diagnostic finds was a bronze bell dated 1705. It was an important clue, but not the only one. A sounding weight, an English blunderbuss barrel, a lead cannon apron, cannonballs, multiple cannon anchors, the wreck location, and the wider artifact assemblage all helped build the case that the site was Blackbeard's lost flagship. Following the initial discovery, state underwater archaeologists descended on the site to map the wreckage before removing it. They did not find a neatly preserved hull resting intact on the sand. The shallow, energetic environment had flattened and scattered the upperworks long before modern divers arrived. By plotting cannon, anchors, ballast, and major concretions, they defined the main concentration of the wreckage and preserved the spatial relationships between artifacts. But the boundaries were not a perfect box, and not every related anchor lay inside the central pile. Finding the magnetic target was a triumph of sensor physics, but what structural nightmare awaited the divers at the center of the field? A shipwreck is not a static graveyard. In a shallow, saltwater environment, the wreckage acts as an active chemical catalyst, relentlessly transforming individual manufactured objects into a singular, solid geological feature. When manufactured cast iron is submerged in an oxygenated, high-energy coastal zone, it immediately begins to deteriorate. But this corrosion does not simply dissolve the metal into the ocean. Instead, it triggers a powerful biochemical chain reaction. As the iron breaks down, it releases metallic ions into the surrounding seawater. These unstable ions rapidly interact with dissolved salts, calcium carbonate naturally secreted by local marine organisms, and the endless supply of suspended sand swirling through the inlet. This continuous reaction precipitates a dense, cement-like crust directly onto the surface of the metal. In marine archaeology, this process is known as marine concretion. It is an unstoppable, localized calcification. Over a span of nearly 300 years, this process did not simply coat the outer surface of each individual weapon. The concretion grew outward, spanning the empty voids between adjacent objects. It engulfed rocks, sand, glass, and smaller loose artifacts, using them as aggregate. As the chemical crust expanded and hardened, it permanently welded the overlapping structural components together. At the center of the wreck site lay the most severe concentration of this chemical fusion. This was the ballast and artillery matrix. To keep a heavily armed, top-heavy ship upright, dense weight was packed deep into the lowest part of the hull. The lower wreck deposit contained ballast stones, heavy iron fittings, anchors, cannon, and smaller artifacts trapped among them. As the vessel degraded, this heavy material settled around and above the surviving keel and framing timbers of the wooden hull. The concretion process fundamentally altered the structural reality of this debris pile. Multiple cast iron cannons, each estimated to weigh over 2,000 pounds, had fallen across one another in a tangled grid. The marine concretion bonded these overlapping 2,000-pound cylinders to the massive iron anchors, the surrounding ballast stones, and thousands of smaller artifacts scattered in the bilge. The overlapping cannons acted like heavy iron rebar poured inside a modern concrete foundation. The entire central ballast pile fused into a single monolithic concretion block. This massive, rock-hard formation created a devastating structural crisis for the recovery team. Beneath this monolithic iron block lay the only surviving architectural framing of the wooden ship. These fragile timbers survived because they had been buried, weighted, and partly shielded from the most destructive energy of the inlet. The ballast and heavy iron helped protect parts of the hull from being swept away, even as the same mass trapped the wood beneath it. But now, that exact same protective layer presented a lethal engineering threat. The concretion had structurally locked the massive iron matrix directly to the delicate, waterlogged wood. Any attempt to blindly pull the iron from the seabed would instantly crush or tear away the wooden architecture trapped underneath. If the heavy iron mass could not be lifted vertically without tearing apart the fragile wood below, how could the wreck be safely dismantled? In 2011, the recovery team reached a critical engineering threshold at the bottom of the inlet. The original objective was a larger anchor, reported at about 13 feet long, positioned on top of the ballast pile. From above, it appeared to be the obvious first target. But once divers assessed it, the anchor proved too well attached to other material in the pile. A forced lift risked disturbing the cannon, ballast, and fragile hull structure below. The team stepped back from that target and chose not to sacrifice the site for the sake of one large artifact. To safely continue without compromising the lower hull, the recovery team had to rethink the approach. Rather than forcing the bonded anchor out from the top of the pile, divers went in from the side and selected a less attached anchor. The wreckage had to be treated like an interlocking puzzle. Each lift had to remove one piece without shifting the one still protecting the wood beneath. Working from the side, the divers identified a new target, Anchor A1, a large fluked anchor that could be lifted without forcing the central pile apart. Contemporary reports described it as roughly 11 feet 4 inches long, 7 feet 7 inches across the flukes, and about 2,500 pounds. Later, Queen Anne's Revenge Project measurements list A1 at 11 feet 7 inches and 1,965 pounds. The safest narration treats those recovery figures as reported estimates, not exact engineering constants. Because this anchor could be approached without forcing the central pile apart, it became the safer target. Divers secured the iron with straps and attached it to lift bags. The bags were inflated underwater, raising the anchor slowly through about 25 feet of water before the crew transferred the lift to the research vessel Dan Moore. The heavy object came aboard under control, leaving the more dangerous central mass undisturbed. The successful lateral extraction proved that the fused wreckage could be safely dismantled component by component. But bringing the heavy iron to the surface was only a logistical victory. With the heavy iron successfully separated and raised, what distinct forensic anomaly was hiding inside the core of the weaponry? In the brutal, highly abrasive environment of a shallow coastal inlet, the survival of organic material is rare. Surf, oxygenated saltwater, sediment, and marine organisms work quickly against cloth, rope, wood, and paper. Yet investigators recovered something astonishing from the wreck. Not a perfect sheet, but tiny fragments of paper, some still bearing legible printed words. This fragile material was not discovered loose in the shifting sand or trapped beneath the heavy ballast stones. It was found in the laboratory inside a mass of wet sludge removed from the chamber of a breech-loading gun component. This was not the open muzzle of one of the large muzzle-loading cannon. It was a reusable powder chamber associated with a smaller breech-loading weapon where textile and paper material may have functioned as wadding or a gasket around the seal. During the final chaotic period before the 1718 grounding, the sealed chamber may have been prepared for use and then lost with the ship. The safest reconstruction is less cinematic than a cannonball frozen behind a perfect clay plug. The paper survived because it was trapped in wet sludge and textile material inside a sealed breech chamber protected from the open flow of the inlet in a way loose paper never could have been. That small enclosed pocket slowed the ordinary destruction of cellulose long enough for conservators to recognize it centuries later. As conservators carefully flushed the internal chamber in the laboratory, taking extreme care not to use high-pressure tools that might shred fragile organics, they successfully extracted the wadding. Unfolding the saturated material revealed 16 intact fragments of paper. Despite spending nearly 300 years completely submerged in a high-energy coastal inlet, the black ink remained clearly legible against the preserved fibers. Forensic analysis of the salvaged text identified the fragments as pages torn from a specific printed book, published in exactly 1712. The survival of the 1712 text was a singular forensic anomaly, completely dependent on the accidental formation of a perfect oxygen-free seal. But the extraction of such delicate evidence from the protective clay marked only the beginning of a much larger, relentless chemical war. Whether dealing with tiny fragments of paper or massive blocks of cast iron, removing material from the ocean fundamentally alters its physical state and restarts the clock on its destruction. Extracting artifacts from the wreck was only the first battle, but how does modern engineering stop the heavy iron from rapidly self-destructing the moment it is exposed to the open air? The exact second a historic iron artifact is pulled from the ocean and breaks the surface of the water, an invisible and lethal chemical timer starts. For nearly 3 centuries, the dense metallic core of the sunken flagship had been completely saturated by the salt water of the Atlantic Inlet. Over hundreds of years, microscopic chloride ions from the seawater had deeply penetrated the porous matrix of the cast iron. As long as the wreckage remained submerged, the lack of atmospheric oxygen kept the rapid corrosion process somewhat contained. But the moment an object like a massive 2,500 to 3,000 pound perimeter anchor is lifted onto the deck of a salvage barge and exposed to dry air, the environment violently shifts. The oxygen in the atmosphere instantly reacts with the embedded salt and residual moisture trapped inside the metal. This aggressive chemical reaction causes the iron to rapidly oxidize from the inside out. Without immediate intervention, the expanding rust forces the metal to crack, flake, and literally tear itself apart. Within a matter of weeks, an imposing naval anchor that survived the brutal physics of a coastal grounding would crumble into a pile of dry red dust. To halt this catastrophic self-destruction, conservators must keep the artifact stable the moment it reaches the laboratory. Heavily concreted iron cannot simply be left on a shelf to dry. It is kept wet while conservators document it, clean it, and begin desalination. For iron from Queen Anne's Revenge, the central problem is chloride. Salt ions have moved through corrosion layers and into weaknesses in the metal. The conservation task is to remove those chlorides slowly under controlled conditions before the artifact can ever be dried for display. For the largest iron objects, conservators use electrolytic reduction. The artifact is placed in a highly alkaline conductive bath, commonly purified water with a small percentage of sodium hydroxide. A low amperage direct current is connected with the negative current applied to the iron artifact and the positive current applied to steel plates in the tank. The negative charge encourages chloride ions to leave the artifact and move into the solution toward the positive plates. Month after month, conservators test the surrounding liquid, change the solution when needed, and continue until the chloride level stops rising and the iron begins to stabilize. This is a grinding, microscopic war of attrition. Electrolytic reduction is not a fast process. Purging a single massive iron artifact can require months or even years of continuous, uninterrupted electrical treatment before the internal chloride levels finally drop to a safe baseline. The sheer scale of the recovered material turns this chemical stabilization into a monumental feat of long-term engineering. Since the site was verified, the assemblage has grown to more than 400,000 individual artifacts, but they do not all follow a single identical route. Iron, lead, ceramics, glass, wood, leather, textile, and paper each demand a material-specific conservation path. Many are kept stable in wet storage, while cleaning, desalination, consolidation, drying, and analysis proceed over years. The physical extraction of the wreckage from the bottom of the ocean was merely the initial phase of the operation. The true salvage effort is a slow, methodical campaign of perpetual stewardship. With more than 400,000 artifacts in the Queen Anne's Revenge assemblage, many requiring long-term conservation before they can safely dry, the final question is not just how to raise a wreck, it is how many years the largest iron guns and anchors must remain in treatment before they surrender the last corrosive remnants of the Atlantic inlet.